I spent most of my life trying to be a good person. Not in a loud way. Not heroically. Quietly. Carefully. The kind of good that doesn't cause problems, doesn't upset anyone, doesn't demand too much space. The kind that fits neatly into expectations and earns nods of approval. I thought that was the point. 10 seconds into this confession, here's the truth I didn't want to face for years: I didn't ruin my life with bad choices. I erased it with good ones made for the wrong reasons. From the beginning, I learned what was expected of me. Be reasonable. Be polite. Be responsible. Don't cause trouble. Don't be dramatic. Don't want too much. Don't risk what you already have. So I didn't. I learned early that approval felt safer than desire. That being praised felt better than being honest. That fitting in was rewarded immediately, while authenticity promised nothing but uncertainty. Every decision I made passed through the same filter: is this the right thing to do? Not, is this what I want? That distinction didn't seem important at first. It became everything. I chose paths that made sense. Jobs that were respectable. Relationships that were appropriate. Words that were measured. Reactions that were controlled. I avoided extremes. Avoided conflict. Avoided anything that might make someone uncomfortable, especially me. People trusted me. They called me reliable. Mature. Balanced. I wore those labels like armor. Inside, I felt strangely absent from my own life. I didn't notice it immediately. That's the danger. Becoming disconnected doesn't hurt at first. It feels like calm. Like stability. Like you've figured things out. You don't realize that calm can also be numbness. I remember moments when I should have felt excited: promotions, milestones, praise, and felt nothing. I told myself that was normal. That adulthood was quieter. That joy matures into something less obvious. But what I felt wasn't mature joy. It was emotional silence. I kept choosing the morally correct option even when it cost me something internal. I stayed in situations longer than I should have because leaving would disappoint someone. I said yes when I wanted to say no because refusing felt selfish. I kept my doubts private because voicing them might disturb the peace. I confused kindness with self-denial. And the world rewarded me for it. That reinforcement is dangerous. When you are praised for disappearing quietly, you learn to do it better. I told myself I was strong because I didn't complain. That I was ethical because I endured. That I was good because I sacrificed without asking for recognition. But strength without honesty becomes endurance without meaning. The first time I noticed something was seriously wrong was during a moment that should have been personal. Someone asked me how I felt about my own life. Not what I thought. Not what made sense. What I felt. I froze. Not because I didn't want to answer. Because I didn't know how. I had spent so long evaluating my actions through morality that I had lost access to my emotional language. I could explain why my life was acceptable. I could justify every decision. I could defend my choices rationally. I couldn't feel them. That scared me, briefly. Then I did what I always did. I chose the right response. I smiled. Changed the subject. Moved on. I told myself it wasn't important. But that question followed me. At night. In quiet moments. In the spaces between responsibilities. It kept returning, asking something I had no tools to answer. Who are you, when you're not being good for someone else? I didn't know. And instead of exploring that unknown, I doubled down on what I did know. Being dependable. Being ethical. Being correct. I became so careful not to hurt anyone that I stopped noticing how much I was hurting myself. I avoided conflict so thoroughly that my inner life became one long compromise. Every desire negotiated down. Every impulse questioned. Every instinct filtered through obligation. Nothing exploded. That's what makes this kind of collapse invisible. My life didn't fall apart. It faded. Slowly. Politely. I started feeling tired in a way rest couldn't fix. A moral fatigue. A deep exhaustion that came from constantly monitoring myself to make sure I was doing the right thing. I began to envy people who made messy choices. People who failed loudly. People who felt deeply even when it hurt. I judged them outwardly and admired them privately. That contradiction ate at me. Because I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't afraid of being wrong. I was afraid of being real, and finding out that real didn't look good. The breaking point didn't arrive as a crisis. It arrived as a realization so quiet it almost slipped past me. If I continued like this, I would reach the end of my life having never done anything truly wrong. And never done anything truly mine. That thought terrified me. Because I understood then that goodness, when it replaces authenticity, doesn't save you. It erases you. And once you've erased yourself long enough, you don't know where to start looking for what's left. After that realization, I tried to fix myself the way a good person would. Quietly. Responsibly. Without bothering anyone. I didn't explode or rebel. I didn't suddenly change my life. I looked for adjustments that wouldn't disturb the structure I had built. I told myself I didn't need a different life, just a better attitude toward the one I had. That thought almost finished me. I started monitoring myself even more carefully. My words. My tone. My reactions. I wanted to be better at being good, hoping that if I perfected the role, the emptiness would finally reward me with peace. It didn't. It deepened. Every time I did the right thing while ignoring what I felt, something inside me tightened. Not loudly. Not violently. Like a muscle held in tension for too long. I began to feel resentment, and that terrified me. Good people aren't supposed to feel resentful. So I buried it. I told myself my anger was ungrateful. My frustration selfish. My desire for more immature. I compared myself to others who had less, who struggled more, who endured worse. I invalidated my own pain with moral logic. That worked, temporarily. But emotions don't disappear when you disprove them. They wait. I noticed I had started living in anticipation of relief that never arrived. I kept thinking, once this responsibility is over, once this phase passes, once I've done enough. Then I'll breathe. Then I'll feel justified wanting something for myself. The problem was that, enough never came. There was always another expectation. Another obligation. Another reason to delay myself. I had built a life where my worth depended on how well I suppressed my inner voice. And suppression has consequences. I began to feel disconnected during moments that should have mattered. Conversations felt scripted. Laughter felt borrowed. I was present physically but absent internally, like someone attending their own life from a distance. People trusted me more than ever. That was the cruel irony. The more invisible I became, the more reliable I appeared. I was praised for my composure. For my patience. For my moral clarity. People came to me for advice, for grounding, for reassurance. I gave it willingly, fluently, while privately feeling like a fraud. Because I couldn't follow my own advice. I told others to listen to themselves, to honor their feelings, to choose honestly. I did none of that. That contradiction started eating at me. The guilt shifted. It wasn't just about wanting more. It was about knowing better and still choosing safety. About recognizing that I was participating in my own erasure, and continuing anyway because it was easier. I felt ashamed of my own passivity. One evening, after yet another situation where I had agreed to something I didn't want, I felt something snap, not outwardly, but internally. A clean, quiet break. I realized I had crossed a line. I no longer felt like a good person. I felt like a well-behaved one. And those are not the same. Being good had become my excuse not to be honest. Not to disappoint. Not to risk rejection. Morality had become a shield I hid behind to avoid responsibility for my own life. That realization hurt more than guilt ever had. Because it meant I couldn't blame circumstances. I couldn't blame others. I had chosen this. Over and over. I started imagining the future more clearly, not as hope, but as repetition. Decades of the same careful choices. The same emotional restraint. The same quiet exhaustion. A life that would be praised at my funeral and barely remembered by me. That image terrified me. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was plausible. I didn't want to die having been admired for a version of myself that never actually lived. And yet, the thought of changing felt immoral in a new way. Choosing myself felt like betrayal. Like abandoning the standards I had built my identity on. Like becoming selfish, unstable, irresponsible. That was the real trap. I had built my entire sense of goodness on self-denial. Without it, I didn't know who I was allowed to be. I stood between two fears. Continue being good and disappear completely. Or risk becoming something imperfect, and finally exist. That tension followed me everywhere. In conversations. In decisions. In moments of silence. I felt like I was living on the edge of a choice I didn't yet know how to make. Until one day, something simple happened. Someone thanked me for always being the same. And instead of pride, I felt grief. Because I understood exactly what they meant. And I didn't want to be that person anymore. I didn't wake up one morning ready to stop being good. If anything, I was terrified of that idea. Goodness had been my shelter. My explanation. My proof that I deserved my place in the world. Without it, I didn't know what justified my existence. I had no alternative identity prepared. No backup version of myself waiting in the wings. So when the moment finally came, it wasn't courageous. It was desperate. I found myself in a situation where the familiar script demanded the same response it always had: compliance, restraint, self-sacrifice. I felt the words forming automatically, ready to come out of my mouth like they had 1,000 times before. And then they didn't. Instead, I said something simple and unforgivable. I don't want to do that. The silence that followed was different from any silence I had known. Not confused. Not gentle. Disappointed. I saw it immediately, the shift in how I was perceived. Not as reliable. Not as stable. Not as morally solid. Just, inconvenient. Uncooperative. Human in a way that didn't fit the role. And the guilt hit me like a wave. Years of conditioning activated at once. The urge to apologize. To explain. To soften it. To retreat. To prove I was still good, still safe, still the same. But something in me refused. For the first time, I let the discomfort stay. The consequences came quickly. Not dramatic consequences. Subtle ones. Trust recalibrated. Expectations adjusted. Distance introduced where there used to be certainty. People didn't confront me, they adapted. I felt myself losing the position I had held so carefully for so long. And I grieved it. More than I expected. Because that role, even though it was suffocating, had given me clarity. Without it, I felt exposed. Undefined. Slightly dangerous. Like someone who had stepped out of formation and didn't know where to stand anymore. There were nights I regretted it immediately. Nights when being good sounded easier than being alone with myself. When I questioned whether authenticity was just selfishness wearing a noble mask. When I wondered if I had thrown away a respectable life for a vague idea of freedom. But something else was happening at the same time. I was starting to feel. Not happiness. Not joy. Friction. Reality pushing back. My days were no longer smooth. Conversations carried risk. Choices carried consequence. I was no longer universally approved of, and that terrified me more than I wanted to admit. But underneath that fear was something unfamiliar. Relief. I wasn't performing anymore. I wasn't measuring myself constantly against an invisible moral standard designed to keep me small and agreeable. I wasn't disappearing to maintain peace. I was present. Some people pulled away completely. I let them. Others stayed, confused but curious. Those relationships changed, not always for the better, but for the honest. I learned quickly that being real costs more than being good. You lose protection. You lose predictability. You lose the comfort of being easily understood. But you gain something quieter and far more dangerous. Agency. I stopped asking if my choices were admirable and started asking if they were true. I stopped volunteering my silence as proof of virtue. I allowed myself to want things without immediately judging those wants. I wasn't kinder. I was clearer. And clarity, I learned, is often mistaken for cruelty by people who benefit from your compliance. I had to mourn the version of myself that was praised for never taking up space. That grief surprised me. Even erasure becomes familiar if you live in it long enough. But I couldn't go back. Because once you realize you've been confusing morality with fear, goodness with obedience, virtue with self-neglect, you can't unknow it. Looking back now, I don't see my old life as a failure. I see it as unfinished. I wasn't bad. I wasn't wrong. I was incomplete. Trying to be a good person didn't destroy me. Trying to be good at the expense of being honest did. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself, the one who's always right, always reasonable, always careful, I'm not telling you to abandon your values. I'm telling you to check where they came from. Because goodness that demands your disappearance is not virtue. It's surrender. I didn't become reckless. I didn't become cruel. I didn't become selfish in the way I feared. I became someone who exists. And for the first time in my life, that feels more meaningful than being approved of. I don't know where this version of me will end up. But I know this. I would rather live an imperfect life that is mine than die admired for a person who never truly lived.